It was supposed to be an ordinary summer day in the quiet streets of Yucaipa, California. A mother stepped out with her infant son, expecting nothing more than a routine errand. But by the end of that day, a community would be shaken to its core, a nation would be glued to the news, and one tiny child would vanish, sparking a story of deception, abuse, and heartbreak that no one could have imagined. The world watched as headlines screamed of a kidnapped baby, while social media erupted with desperate pleas to help find him. Authorities raced against the clock, scouring streets and neighborhoods, yet every lead seemed to vanish into thin air. But as detectives dug deeper, they began to notice subtle cracks in the story, inconsistencies that didn't make sense, surveillance footage that didn't match witness accounts, and a timeline that raised chilling questions. What appeared at first to be a straightforward missing child case was about to take a turn so shocking, so dark, that the truth would challenge everything the public thought they knew. The question now hung in the air like a shadow over the town. Was Emmanuel really taken by a stranger, or was the danger far closer to home? And that question is where our story begins. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't so you keep updated as this case unfolds. Justice for baby Haro Emmanuel. Comment below where you are watching from, like and share so you help bring this story to limelight. It was an ordinary summer morning in the quiet, sun-soaked community of Yucaipa, California, a city nestled among rolling hills and small suburban streets. On the surface, life moved at a familiar pace. Children played in the yards, neighbors exchanged greetings over picket fences, and the hum of daily routines filled the air. Yet, beneath this calm exterior, an ordinary day would soon spiral into an unimaginable tragedy, one that would grip the entire nation and leave a community reeling. Emmanuel Haro was just 7 months old. A tiny infant with the soft features and innocent gaze typical of a child at that age, he represented the fragile promise of life, the hope and love of two parents, or so it seemed. On August 14, 2025, Emmanuel's parents, Jake and Rebecca Haro, would set the stage for a story that shocked the nation, a story that would blur the lines between heartbreak, deception, and crime. The day began like any other, with the sun rising over Yucaipa's residential streets, illuminating the modest homes and well-kept lawns. Inside one of these homes, Rebecca Haro prepared for what she claimed would be a quick errand with her infant son. The plan, she later reported, was simple: a brief stop at a nearby shopping area to change Emmanuel's diaper in a public parking lot. Parents do such things all the time, assuming the mundane safety of their surroundings. But that ordinary errand would become the backdrop for a story that no one could have predicted. According to Rebecca's account, tragedy struck almost immediately. She would later tell law enforcement that while changing Emmanuel in the parking lot, she was suddenly attacked. In the chaos and terror of that alleged assault, she claimed, Emmanuel was snatched from her arms by an unknown assailant. Her voice, trembling with fear, reportedly conveyed a mother's worst nightmare: her child had been taken. The police were called immediately, and the story quickly spread across social media and local news outlets. Within hours, the name Emmanuel Haro was on the lips of thousands. Authorities launched a full-scale search, canvassing the parking lot, surrounding streets, and even nearby desert areas in what became a frantic race against time. News coverage painted a harrowing picture: an infant abducted in broad daylight, a mother in distress, and a community paralyzed with fear and sympathy. As details emerged, it became clear that this was no ordinary missing child case. Every available law enforcement resource in the area was mobilized, from patrol units to detectives, all working around the clock to find the missing boy. Social media exploded with calls to share information, local news helicopters hovered over streets and parks, and neighbors left messages of concern and prayer. The narrative seemed straightforward: a mother attacked, a baby kidnapped, and a desperate search underway. Yet, even in the earliest hours, subtle inconsistencies began to emerge. Surveillance cameras from nearby stores captured portions of the scene, and some witnesses offered statements that did not fully align with Rebecca's version of events. Detectives, trained to notice the smallest discrepancies, quietly began to examine the story from every angle. Something they sensed did not add up. But at this point, no one could have predicted the depths of the deception, the darkness hidden beneath the initial panic. As the day progressed, the emotional weight of the situation settled heavily on the community. Schools sent notifications to parents, neighbors organized search parties, and residents lined streets with posters depicting Emmanuel's tiny face and pleading for information. The urgency was palpable, Every hour without answers heightened the tension. Interviews with family members painted Emmanuel as a happy, healthy infant, whose presence brought joy to those around him. Parents and relatives described a child who, in the brief span of his life, had already captured the hearts of everyone he met. Meanwhile, law enforcement faced the dual challenge of responding to an alleged kidnapping and ensuring the mother's safety. Rebecca's own account suggested that she had been attacked, a claim that would have warranted immediate protection and medical attention. Detectives meticulously documented her statements, cross-referencing them with physical evidence, forensic analysis, and digital data. Phone records, timestamps, and security footage were all reviewed in painstaking detail. Every angle was scrutinized. Every word counted. By late afternoon, questions began to surface. The pieces of the puzzle, statements from witnesses, timestamps from store cameras, and preliminary forensic reports, suggested discrepancies that could not be ignored. Law enforcement, while still hoping for a positive outcome, quietly started exploring alternative explanations for Emmanuel's disappearance. Could the alleged abduction have been a misunderstanding? Or something far more sinister? As night fell over Yucaipa, the search continued. Police vehicles patrolled the streets, volunteers combed local parks, and the community held its collective breath. National media had begun covering the case, amplifying the tragedy to an audience far beyond California. Every mention of Emmanuel's name carried with it the weight of hope, fear, and sorrow. Social media campaigns encouraged people to share and help find Emmanuel, and hashtags flooded Twitter and Instagram. The world seemed united in its desire for answers. But beneath the surface, investigators were beginning to see a darker narrative forming. While the nation's attention focused on the possibility of a heroic rescue, detectives were uncovering early signs that the story may not be as it seemed. Surveillance video did not corroborate the claimed abduction. Witness statements were contradictory. And behind closed doors, questions were being asked that would eventually reveal a truth more tragic than anyone could have imagined. August 14, 2025, marked the beginning of a case that would unfold with twists, legal battles, and shocking revelations. It was a day that transformed a peaceful suburban community into the epicenter of national attention, and a day that would haunt investigators, neighbors, and ultimately the world. Emmanuel Haro's disappearance set into motion a chain of events that exposed the fragility of trust, the darkness that can hide behind a family's facade, and the devastating consequences of lies when innocent lives are at stake. In the coming hours and days, what appeared to be a straightforward missing child case would unravel into one of the most harrowing investigations in recent memory, a case involving deception, abuse, and the shocking reality of a child lost under the most tragic circumstances. And as the sun set on that fateful day, one truth became painfully clear: nothing would ever be the same for Emmanuel, his family, or the community that had come together to search for him. This was the day everything changed. August 14, 2025. In the hours and days following Emmanuel Haro's disappearance, the world held its collective breath. News outlets reported the story with urgency: a 7-month-old infant taken in broad daylight, a mother left traumatized, and a community desperate for answers. At first glance, it was a narrative that seemed all too familiar, a tragic abduction that demanded immediate action. But as the investigation deepened, detectives began to uncover inconsistencies that would shift the case from a missing child story to something far more disturbing. The first cracks appeared in the details of the mother's account. Rebecca Haro had described the abduction with vivid emotion, painting a scene of chaos and violence in the parking lot where she claimed she was attacked while changing Emmanuel's diaper. But law enforcement, trained to detect discrepancies in statements and behavior, noticed subtle irregularities. For example, surveillance cameras in the area captured moments that did not align with Rebecca's story. Footage showed her entering the parking lot calmly, with no sign of struggle. There were no witnesses who saw an assailant take the baby, despite the lot being busy during that time. Detectives began to probe deeper. They interviewed neighbors, passers-by, and store employees, seeking anyone who might have witnessed the alleged kidnapping. But no corroborating evidence emerged. Each interview added more questions than answers. How could such a violent act occur without anyone seeing or hearing it? Why did the timeline of events fail to match physical evidence? With each new discovery, the investigators' confidence in the abduction story began to erode. It was at this point that law enforcement started to consider an unthinkable possibility. What if the kidnapping had never happened at all? The idea was difficult to accept. The emotional weight of the case, the image of a missing infant, the mother's terrified account, had already captured public attention. Yet detectives had learned through years of experience that in some of the most shocking cases, the truth is hidden behind layers of deception. Forensic experts examined the parking lot and surrounding areas meticulously. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints or physical evidence pointing to a third party. Cell phone data and timestamps were analyzed, revealing inconsistencies with the timeline Rebecca had described. Even minor details, the positioning of Emmanuel's stroller, the angle of Rebecca's car, the lack of any nearby surveillance of a suspect, contradicted the narrative she had provided. As evidence mounted, investigators widened their focus to include the parents themselves. Jake Haro, Emmanuel's father, came under scrutiny. His prior criminal history raised immediate red flags. In 2018, he had been convicted of abusing another infant in the family, a case that left the child permanently disabled. Prosecutors noted that someone with such a history should never have been in a position to care for Emmanuel. The revelation added a grim layer to the investigation, forcing authorities to confront the possibility that Emmanuel's disappearance was not an accident, but rather the result of abuse within the very family entrusted to protect him. At the same time, the public narrative began to shift. News outlets reported on the emerging inconsistencies, framing the case as a mysterious missing child, while hinting at potential deception. Social media speculation ran rampant. Online sleuths dissected photos and videos, debating whether the Haros account could be true. While some still held hope that Emmanuel had been taken by a stranger, others began to wonder whether the story had been fabricated from the start. Detective suspicions turned into active investigation. They began re-interviewing Rebecca Haro, carefully questioning her story and probing for details that could be verified. The tone of these interviews was deliberate, methodical, a professional blend of patience and scrutiny aimed at unraveling the truth. Each question was measured, each response analyzed, as officers pieced together a timeline that increasingly contradicted the narrative of an abduction. Soon, investigators focused on a chilling conclusion: the kidnapping had been staged. Every piece of evidence, from the surveillance footage to eyewitness accounts, and the physical investigation of the parking lot, pointed to a stark reality. Emmanuel had never been taken by a stranger. The mother's story, so convincing to the outside world, had been carefully constructed to mask a far more sinister truth. The realization sent shockwaves through the investigation. Detectives now faced the harrowing task of confronting a family that had deceived them, a reality that would eventually lead to confessions, arrests, and charges that stunned the nation. The missing baby story, once framed as a tragic abduction, began to reveal its true nature, a case of child abuse, concealment, and deceit at the heart of the very family meant to protect Emmanuel. Meanwhile, the community struggled to process the unfolding truth. Parents, neighbors, and local residents who had rallied in support of Emmanuel's safe return began to feel a mix of disbelief, anger, and heartbreak. The media, which had initially broadcast images of a frightened mother pleading for help, now reported on the mounting evidence against the parents. Public sentiment shifted from concern for a missing child to outrage at a family capable of deception and harm. The stage was set for a case that would not only expose the depths of parental betrayal, but also challenge the justice system to respond swiftly and decisively. What began as a simple parking lot errand had spiraled into a narrative of manipulation and tragedy, setting the course for arrests, confessions, and legal battles that would dominate headlines for months to come. The false kidnapping, as it came to be known in investigative circles, marked the moment when the investigation pivoted. No longer a story of hope for a safe return, it became a story of reckoning, a search not for an abductor, but for answers within a family that had betrayed trust in the most profound and devastating way imaginable. By the end of that week, law enforcement had gathered enough evidence to begin taking concrete legal action. The focus was no longer on finding Emmanuel as a missing child in the hands of strangers. The search had shifted to uncovering the truth behind the home, the people charged with his care, and the sequence of events that led to his untimely death. It was a turning point, a moment when the public would begin to understand that the reality behind Emmanuel Haro's disappearance was far darker than anyone could have imagined. And so the second chapter of this tragedy began, a chapter in which lies unraveled, truths emerged, and the chilling reality of Emmanuel's fate slowly came into focus. What had started as a mother's cry for help transformed into a criminal investigation, exposing the devastating truth hidden behind the facade of a suburban family. The world, once captivated by hope, now braced itself for the grim revelations yet to come. Once the initial shock of Emmanuel Haro's disappearance began to settle, law enforcement pivoted from a frantic search for a missing infant to a meticulous investigation aimed at uncovering the truth behind the staged kidnapping. Detectives from the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department knew that the case was no longer about a child taken by an unknown assailant. The inconsistencies in Rebecca Haro's story and the lack of evidence pointing to an abductor had transformed the investigation into a complex inquiry into potential parental involvement. The first step for investigators was to examine the crime scene with a microscopic level of detail. The parking lot where the alleged abduction occurred was swept for forensic evidence, fingerprints, fibers, and any signs of a struggle. Surveillance footage from nearby stores was scrutinized frame by frame. Even minor details, such as tire tracks, the placement of strollers and footprints, were catalogued and cross-referenced. What the detectives discovered only deepened their suspicion. There were no traces of a third-party assailant, no footprints of an intruder, and no evidence of a sudden attack. Every piece of physical evidence contradicted the mother's account. As forensic teams worked tirelessly on the scene, investigators turned their attention to the digital footprint of both parents. Cell phone records, GPS data, and call logs were meticulously analyzed. These digital breadcrumbs provided critical insights into the timeline of events leading up to and following Emmanuel's disappearance. It became evident that the story told to the public did not align with the digital evidence. Specific locations, times, and communications raised further questions about the Haros narrative, suggesting that the child's fate had occurred earlier and in a context entirely different from what had been described. Simultaneously, detectives began a thorough review of the family's history, uncovering details that painted a disturbing picture. Jake Haro, Emmanuel's father, had a documented history of child abuse. In 2018, he had been convicted for abusing another infant in a household, a case that resulted in permanent disabilities for that child. Prosecutors highlighted that Jake's prior conviction should have prevented him from accessing children, yet he was again in a position of trust. This information became a pivotal piece of the investigation, reinforcing the possibility that Emmanuel's death was not an accident but the tragic outcome of ongoing abuse. Interviews with family members, neighbors, and friends provided additional context. Investigators learned that the Haros home environment was turbulent, with reports of arguments and concerning behavior that had gone unaddressed by authorities. While neighbors had noticed little outwardly suspicious activity, law enforcement's deeper inquiries revealed subtle warning signs, inconsistent childcare routines, reports of unexplained injuries in the past, and accounts of behavioral patterns that aligned with neglect or abuse. These details began to paint a fuller, more troubling portrait of life inside the Haro household. Law enforcement also employed psychological and behavioral analysis to interpret the actions of both parents. Detectives noticed patterns of deception and manipulation in their statements, behavior during interviews, and responses to investigative pressure. Experts in child abuse and family violence were consulted to assess the credibility of the parents' claims and to anticipate potential confessions or admissions. Each layer of analysis strengthened the case against the Haros, providing a framework for the charges that would soon follow. Meanwhile, the investigation's progress was made public with careful precision. Media outlets reported updates on the lack of evidence supporting the abduction claim and noted the intensifying scrutiny on the parents. Social media discussions, which had initially been filled with hope for a miraculous recovery, shifted toward speculation about parental involvement. The community's emotional response mirrored that of the investigators: disbelief, concern, and growing apprehension that the truth might be far darker than anyone had anticipated. By this stage, law enforcement had begun to piece together a preliminary timeline of events. It appeared that Emmanuel's death occurred before the supposed abduction. The staging of the kidnapping, investigators concluded, was a deliberate attempt to mislead authorities and the public. Detectives meticulously documented this sequence, collecting statements, physical evidence, and digital data to ensure a solid foundation for potential criminal charges. Every fact was corroborated, every discrepancy noted, as investigators prepared to confront the Haros with the full weight of their findings. The investigation also revealed procedural and systemic concerns. Questions arose about how a previously convicted child abuser had access to Emmanuel, and why warning signs may have gone unaddressed. These findings would later play a role not only in the criminal case but also in broader discussions about child protection policies and oversight mechanisms. The case, already tragic, became emblematic of systemic failures that allowed abuse to continue unchecked. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, it became clear that law enforcement was closing in on the truth. Surveillance evidence, forensic data, witness accounts, and digital footprints all pointed to the same grim reality. Emmanuel's disappearance was no random act of violence, no unfortunate accident in a public space. Instead, it was the culmination of abuse, deception, and carefully staged misdirection. The detectives' relentless work set the stage for what would ultimately be confessions, arrests, and the unraveling of a narrative that had gripped the nation. In retrospect, the investigation's tightening grip marked a crucial turning point. What had begun as a mysterious abduction story had evolved into a complex web of parental culpability, criminal behavior, and a community's reckoning with the darkest possibilities. Emmanuel Haro's story was no longer one of hope and rescue. It had transformed into a harrowing case study of child abuse, manipulation, and the pursuit of justice in the face of unimaginable betrayal. By the end of this investigative phase, law enforcement was ready to take decisive action. Armed with evidence, expert testimony, and a thorough understanding of the events leading up to Emmanuel's disappearance, detectives prepared to confront the parents and press charges that would send shockwaves through the community. The stage was set for the next chapter, a chapter of confessions, legal battles, and the eventual unraveling of the Haro's carefully constructed facade. The investigation had tightened, and the truth, once obscured by fear and lies, was finally beginning to emerge. As the investigation into Emmanuel Haro's disappearance deepened, the weight of evidence against the Haros began to close in. Surveillance footage, witness accounts, forensic analysis, and digital records had all converged to create a stark and inescapable truth: Emmanuel had never been kidnapped by a stranger. The child's tragic fate lay somewhere much closer to home. Detectives focused their attention on Jake Haro, Emmanuel's father. His prior history of abuse had already cast suspicion in sharp relief, and investigators now had reason to believe that he was directly involved in his son's death. Interviews with both parents were carefully conducted, each session a calculated blend of strategy and patience. Law enforcement knew that the first cracks could emerge at any moment. The subtle admissions, the small inconsistencies in speech, or a lapse in composure could reveal the truth hidden behind the Haros' carefully constructed narrative. It was during these interrogations that the chilling reality began to surface. Under mounting evidence, Jake Haro eventually admitted to playing a central role in Emmanuel's death. Prosecutors later revealed that the abuse had been sustained over a period of time, not an isolated incident. The staged kidnapping, the story of an abduction in a public parking lot, had been orchestrated to mask a crime far more sinister: the abuse and eventual death of a defenseless infant at the hands of the people sworn to protect him. Jake's confession sent shockwaves through the investigation. Law enforcement officials described it as a turning point, one that confirmed the suspicions which had been mounting since the first hours of the inquiry. The father's admission not only provided clarity about the events leading to Emmanuel's death, but also exposed the depths of deception involved in the Haros' initial claims. What had been presented as a public tragedy, a baby taken in broad daylight, was in reality a harrowing story of parental betrayal and concealment. With the confession secured, the next step was arrest. Authorities moved quickly, understanding the gravity of the case and the need to prevent further harm. Jake Haro was taken into custody, charged with second-degree murder, assault on a child under the age of 8 resulting in death, and filing a false police report. The charges reflected not only his direct involvement in Emmanuel's death, but also the deliberate attempt to mislead law enforcement and the public with a staged kidnapping narrative. The arrest shocked the community. Residents of Yucaipa, who had spent days organizing searches and sharing Emmanuel's story across social media, struggled to reconcile the horrific reality with the story they had been told. Local news outlets reported the details with increasing gravity, highlighting both the confession and the father's prior history of child abuse. Social media erupted with reactions ranging from grief to outrage, as the public grappled with the tragic and preventable death of a child. Meanwhile, the investigation into Rebecca Haro, Emmanuel's mother, intensified. Law enforcement examined her role in the staged kidnapping and the concealment of her son's death. Though Jake had confessed, questions remained about whether Rebecca had been an active participant in the abuse, a passive enabler, or a collaborator in the cover-up. Authorities scrutinized her statements, digital communications, and actions during the critical hours surrounding Emmanuel's disappearance, laying the groundwork for further legal action. The father's confession also provided key details about the timeline of events, offering investigators a clearer understanding of Emmanuel's final hours. Prosecutors revealed that the abuse had occurred prior to the purported kidnapping, confirming that the child's death was not the result of a single, isolated incident, but rather a culmination of sustained neglect and violence. Each revelation added to the gravity of the case, making it one of the most shocking child abuse investigations in recent California history. Public reaction to the confession was immediate and intense. Community members expressed grief, anger, and disbelief. Experts in child welfare noted the systemic failures that had allowed a previously convicted abuser to retain access to children. News commentators emphasized the tragic lessons embedded in the case, the critical importance of monitoring at-risk families, the dangers of ignoring prior abuse, and the devastating consequences of parental betrayal. For law enforcement, Jake Haro's confession marked the beginning of the legal phase of the case. With his admission, prosecutors were able to prepare a strong case for court. The father's plea would later form the basis for charges that carried the maximum penalties allowable under California law. At the same time, detectives continued to pursue leads regarding Emmanuel's remains, understanding that justice and closure required not only legal accountability but also the recovery of the child's body. The confession, arrest, and mounting evidence painted a stark, unflinching portrait of a family tragedy that had been hidden behind layers of deception. Jake Haro's dark secret, his direct role in the abuse and death of his own son, shattered the community's perception of the case and revealed a sobering truth. Sometimes, the greatest danger comes from those who claim to love and protect us. By the end of this chapter in the investigation, law enforcement had achieved a major breakthrough. The father's confession not only clarified the sequence of events, but also set the stage for the ensuing legal battles. The case, once framed as a missing child scenario, had now become a cautionary tale of abuse, manipulation, and the relentless pursuit of truth in the face of unimaginable betrayal. And yet, even with the confession secured, the story was far from over. Questions remained about Rebecca Haro's role, the location of Emmanuel's remains, and how such a tragedy could have occurred despite the father's criminal history. The community, investigators, and the nation waited for justice to unfold, knowing that the next chapters of this story would reveal even deeper truths about a family tragedy that had gripped the world. With the father's confession secured and his arrest finalized, the Emmanuel Haro case entered a new and highly scrutinized phase, the legal battle. The eyes of the nation were now on the courtroom, where justice would be pursued not just for Emmanuel, but as a statement against the horrors of child abuse and parental deception. Jake Haro, Emmanuel's father, faced a litany of serious charges. Prosecutors filed counts of second-degree murder, assault on a child under 8 resulting in death, and filing a false police report. These charges reflected both the physical abuse Emmanuel suffered and the elaborate efforts to mislead law enforcement and the public with a staged kidnapping story. On October 16, 2025, Jake Haro formally pleaded guilty to all charges. His plea sent shockwaves through the courtroom and the wider community, confirming the grim truth that the infant's death had been caused intentionally and tragically at the hands of the very person meant to protect him. The sentencing for Jake Haro was set for November 3, 2025, a date that would carry with it both the promise of legal closure and the weight of unhealed grief. During pre-sentencing proceedings, prosecutors highlighted the father's prior criminal history, including the 2018 conviction for abusing another infant in the family, a child who was left permanently disabled. This prior abuse underscored the systemic failures that had allowed Jake continued access to children, amplifying public outrage and emphasizing the necessity of a strong legal response. Meanwhile, attention turned to Rebecca Haro, Emmanuel's mother. While Jake's plea established his culpability, Rebecca's role remained under intense scrutiny. Authorities charged her with murder and filing a false police report, reflecting the belief that she had been complicit in both the abuse and the cover-up. However, unlike her husband, Rebecca pleaded not guilty to the amended complaint. Her decision set the stage for a legal battle that would test the limits of evidence, testimony, and investigative rigor. The courtroom became a focal point for the unfolding tragedy. Prosecutors argued that Rebecca Haro had knowingly participated in the deception that followed Emmanuel's death, helping to stage the kidnapping and prevent authorities from discovering the truth. Defense attorneys countered by emphasizing her cooperation with law enforcement and disputing the extent of her involvement in the abuse, framing her as a mother who was misled or coerced by her husband. These opposing narratives created a tense and suspenseful legal environment, where the truth had to be weighed against competing interpretations of events. As pre-trial motions, evidentiary hearings, and discovery proceedings unfolded, public attention remained riveted. Media outlets provided detailed coverage of the legal strategies, court filings, and community reactions. Social media became a platform for debate, as viewers and readers speculated on the likely outcomes, the motivations of each parent, and the broader implications for child welfare policies. The Haro case was no longer just a local tragedy. It had become a national story about justice, accountability, and the consequences of unchecked abuse. One of the central challenges in Rebecca Haro's case was the absence of Emmanuel's body. While her husband's confession provided details about the abuse and timeline of events, the location of the child's remains remained unknown. This gap added complexity to the prosecution's case, requiring them to rely heavily on witness statements, forensic evidence, and the father's admissions. Legal experts noted that while a body is not strictly necessary to secure a murder conviction, the lack of physical evidence could complicate proceedings, particularly in establishing direct causation and proving intent beyond a reasonable doubt. The contrasting pleas of the Haros highlighted the duality of the legal narrative, guilt admitted versus guilt denied. Jake's confession established undeniable culpability and allowed prosecutors to focus their efforts on securing a meaningful sentence, while Rebecca's not guilty plea ensured that the courtroom drama would continue. The tension between these two legal paths created a suspenseful narrative that extended far beyond the immediate parties, drawing attention to the broader issues of child protection, family violence, and the limitations of the justice system in preventing repeated abuse. Throughout the proceedings, community reaction remained intense. Local residents, advocates for child welfare, and concerned citizens watched closely, hoping for accountability and closure. Emotional responses ranged from sorrow and anger to frustration at systemic failures that had allowed a known abuser continued access to children. Public pressure underscored the importance of transparency, thorough investigation, and the pursuit of justice in a case that had already captured national attention. As the legal battle continued, the focus on sentencing became paramount. Jake Haro's guilty plea set the stage for a potentially lengthy prison term, reflecting both the severity of the crime and the necessity of a strong deterrent against child abuse. Rebecca Haro's trial, still pending at this stage, promised to test the prosecution's ability to prove her complicity and provide clarity on the final chapter of Emmanuel Haro's tragic story. The courtroom became the theater where the consequences of deception, abuse, and betrayal were fully realized. What had begun as a story of a missing child had evolved into a legal and moral reckoning, where the full truth of Emmanuel's fate would be weighed, scrutinized, and judged. Each hearing, plea, and motion brought the community closer to understanding the depth of the tragedy and the responsibilities of those entrusted with justice. In the end, the legal battle reflected both the complexity of the case and the relentless pursuit of accountability. The contrasting pleas of the parents, one guilty, one not guilty, ensured that the story would continue to unfold, keeping the world's attention focused on the search for justice for Emmanuel Haro. The case stood as a grim reminder that behind every headline, every news segment, and every courtroom drama, there lies the haunting reality of human actions and the irrevocable consequences they leave behind. Even as the legal proceedings against Jake and Rebecca Haro moved forward, one haunting reality remained: Emmanuel Haro's body had never been found. For investigators, the absence of physical remains transformed the case into an agonizing search for closure. While the courtroom battles would determine legal accountability, the community and authorities alike were left with the urgent and unanswered question: where was Emmanuel? From the very beginning, law enforcement had conducted extensive searches of the areas surrounding Yucaipa, California, and other locations tied to the Haros. Detectives and search teams scoured neighborhoods, parks, desert areas, and even landfills, examining every possibility that could lead to the recovery of the child's remains. Search dogs, forensic teams, and specialized equipment were deployed, yet week after week, the results were inconclusive. Each unsuccessful search intensified the sense of urgency and grief among both investigators and the public. The lack of a recovered body also presented complex challenges for the prosecution. While Jake Haro's confession provided crucial details about Emmanuel's death, the The physical evidence of his remains was necessary not only for definitive closure but also to support the legal case against Rebecca Haro. Prosecutors relied heavily on testimonial evidence, forensic analysis of the home environment, and admissions from Jake to build their case. The ongoing search underscored the stark reality that justice could be pursued even in the absence of the most critical piece of evidence, the child himself. The community, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile the known facts with the unknown. Emmanuel's disappearance had become a media focal point, with coverage that highlighted both the legal proceedings and the desperate efforts to locate his remains. Neighbors, parents, and volunteers continued to assist in searches, holding vigils, and sharing updates on social media, determined to keep Emmanuel's name alive and push for answers. The emotional weight of the search was palpable, hope, despair, and anger intertwined in a collective longing for resolution. Investigators also considered the logistical and psychological aspects of the case. Understanding the movements and actions of both parents, the areas where the child could have been taken, and potential disposal locations became central to the ongoing search. Every piece of evidence from the home, surveillance footage, and witness statements was re-examined in the context of potential recovery. Experts in forensic archaeology and child death investigations were consulted to assess the likelihood of finding remains in certain locations and to develop strategies for future searches. Despite the challenges, authorities remained resolute. The San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department emphasized that the search for Emmanuel would continue until the child was recovered, reflecting a commitment not only to justice but to the basic human need for closure. Public statements from law enforcement underscored this dedication, reinforcing the message that the investigation was far from over and that every lead, no matter how small, would be pursued. The continued absence of Emmanuel also had a profound psychological impact on the community. The emotional toll on local residents, who had watched the case unfold in real time, was significant. Parents reported heightened anxiety about the safety of their own children, while neighbors and volunteers expressed frustration at the inability to locate the child despite months of diligent searching. The case became a cautionary tale, highlighting the vulnerability of children and the importance of vigilance and systemic protection. In addition to the physical search, investigators worked tirelessly to piece together the final movements of Emmanuel's life. Each interaction within the home, each event leading up to the staged kidnapping, and each digital footprint left behind were meticulously mapped. These efforts provided critical insights into the timeline of abuse, the moments leading to the child's death, and the sequence of deception orchestrated by the parents. While the location of Emmanuel remained unknown, the reconstruction of his final hours offered a semblance of understanding and hope for eventual recovery. The search for Emmanuel also drew national attention. News outlets highlighted the tragic irony. Despite a confession from his father and a legal process underway, the world still had no physical evidence of the child's whereabouts. Public interest remained intense, with advocates, reporters, and viewers following every update, hoping for a breakthrough. Each news cycle reinforced the tragic reality that Emmanuel's fate, while legally addressed, was still physically unresolved. As days turned into weeks and months, the search continued to test the limits of law enforcement resources and public patience. Every lead, tip, and investigative avenue was pursued with diligence, yet the child remained elusive. The absence of closure served as a stark reminder of the profound consequences of abuse, deception, and systemic oversight failures. Emmanuel's story became more than a legal case. It became a symbol of both tragedy and the unrelenting quest for justice in the face of unspeakable loss. The search for Emmanuel Haro remains ongoing, a grim and poignant testament to the enduring uncertainty that surrounds cases of child abuse and parental betrayal. While Jake Haro's guilty plea provided legal clarity, and while Rebecca Haro's trial continues to hold the world's attention, the location of Emmanuel's remains is a haunting question that lingers. The physical absence of the child serves as a chilling reminder that, in some tragedies, the consequences of human actions extend far beyond what the law can immediately address. In the end, the search for Emmanuel is not just about a missing body. It is about truth, accountability, and the hope that justice and resolution can coexist with grief and loss. It is a story that continues to unfold, a story that commands attention, reflection, and remembrance. And until the day Emmanuel is found, the search, and the questions it raises, will remain at the heart of this tragic case. With the investigation concluded and Jake Haro's guilty plea secured, the Emmanuel Haro case entered its final and most scrutinized phase, the pursuit of justice and the aftermath of a tragedy that had gripped an entire community. Yet even as the legal system moved forward, one critical fact remained painfully clear: Emmanuel's remains had not been recovered, leaving an unhealed void in the hearts of his family, the community, and the nation. Jake Haro awaited sentencing on November 3, 2025, facing a potential life sentence for the brutal abuse and murder of his infant son. Prosecutors emphasized the severity of the crime, highlighting not only the sustained abuse and eventual death of Emmanuel, but also the father's previous conviction for harming another infant. The legal system had the opportunity to ensure accountability and send a strong message about the consequences of child abuse, particularly in cases where prior convictions should have prevented further tragedy. Meanwhile, Rebecca Haro's case remained unresolved. She had pleaded not guilty to charges including murder and filing a false police report. Her trial would explore whether she had actively participated in the abuse, helped conceal Emmanuel's death, or played a role in orchestrating the staged kidnapping. Prosecutors were tasked with piecing together evidence from interviews, forensic findings, digital records, and Jake's confession to establish her level of involvement. The courtroom battle promised to be tense, emotional, and filled with difficult questions about complicity, accountability, and parental responsibility. The aftermath of the case extended beyond the courtroom. The tragic events surrounding Emmanuel's death sparked broader discussions about child protection systems, the monitoring of previously convicted abusers, and the societal responsibility to protect vulnerable children. Advocates and experts called for reforms to ensure that warning signs of abuse are addressed more effectively, preventing tragedies like Emmanuel's from occurring in the future. The case served as a grim reminder that systemic failures can have devastating consequences. For the community of Yucaipa, the story of Emmanuel Haro remained a painful chapter in local history. Vigils, memorials, and community discussions kept the child's memory alive, while residents grappled with feelings of grief, anger, and disbelief. Parents, in particular, were reminded of the fragility of childhood and the importance of vigilance in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The emotional weight of the case lingered, a testament to the enduring impact of such a profound tragedy. Law enforcement continued to pursue every lead regarding Emmanuel's remains, demonstrating a commitment not only to legal accountability but to the fundamental human need for closure. Even as the legal system progressed, detectives remained determined to locate the child, underscoring that justice involves more than verdicts and sentences. It requires truth, resolution, and acknowledgement of the life lost. The Emmanuel Haro case also captured the attention of the nation and the world. Media outlets highlighted the contrasts within the story: the father's guilty plea versus the mother's ongoing trial, the unresolved location of the child versus the courtroom resolutions, and the systemic lessons that could be drawn from the tragedy. The case became a symbol of both grief and the relentless pursuit of justice, demonstrating how even the darkest circumstances can prompt reflection, reform, and vigilance. As the legal proceedings unfold, one thing is certain: the story of Emmanuel Haro will not be forgotten. It has become a benchmark for child protection advocacy, a lesson in the consequences of deception, and a chilling reminder of the fragility of life. The combination of confession, legal accountability, and ongoing searches reflects a justice system striving to reconcile the irreversible loss of a child with society's need for answers and accountability. In the end, the aftermath of Emmanuel Haro's death underscores a harsh reality: the truth, no matter how painful, must emerge. The search for justice, closure, and systemic reform continues, ensuring that Emmanuel's story serves as a catalyst for awareness, accountability, and prevention. While the legal battles may conclude, the emotional, societal, and ethical reverberations of this case will endure, reminding the world of the profound consequences of abuse, the importance of vigilance, and the enduring hope that every child deserves protection. The Emmanuel Haro case stands as a somber testament to tragedy, deception, and the pursuit of justice. And while some questions may never be fully answered, the relentless search for truth and accountability ensures that Emmanuel's memory lives on, demanding that society confront the darkest realities to prevent them from repeating. The story of Emmanuel Haro is a chilling reminder of how quickly tragedy can strike and how deception can hide the darkest truths. Even as one chapter closes with arrests, confessions, and courtroom battles, the questions remain unanswered. Emmanuel's remains have yet to be found, and the full extent of Rebecca Haro's involvement is still unfolding in court. Every discovery, every confession, every piece of evidence adds a new layer to this heartbreaking case, and the search for justice is far from over. How deep did the deception go? Will Emmanuel's remains ever be found? And what lessons will society learn from a tragedy that could have been prevented? The answers to these questions are still out there, waiting to be uncovered. Stay tuned, because the next chapter in this shocking story promises revelations that will leave even the most seasoned investigators stunned. If you want to follow the full journey, from the first heartbreaking disappearance to the final courtroom verdict, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and never miss an update. Emmanuel's story is not over, and neither is the pursuit of justice.